My name is Angela Febres, and I'm a senior at Rutgers University. My major was political science, and for my honors thesis, I decided to look at the effect of voter identification laws on non-traditional forms of participation. After the highly contentious elections in the year 2000, Congress took some reform steps in 2002 by implementing the Help America Vote Act. And this act now required that first-time in-person voters present identification when they went to the polls. This was different than what was previously required, and at this time, or actually prior to the Help America Vote Act, there were only 3 states that had voter identification laws. After the Help America Vote Act, we saw a huge surge in the number of states that decided to implement laws that went beyond what the Help America Vote Act required. And by the year 2018, there were 35 states that had voter identification laws. Another reason why we had a huge surge in the number of states that took up voter identification laws was because in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County versus Holder that states that were previously active in voter suppression or voter discrimination efforts that required pre-clearance to be able to make changes to their election laws or their election regulations would no longer have to do so. As we've had an increase in the number of laws that have been implemented, we've also had obviously an increase in the research literature that in political science looking at the effects of these laws and whether these laws have an effect or not. Some scholars do say that there is an effect to these laws, particularly for minority voters, whereas other scholars say that the effects are not statistically significant or also pretty minuscule and therefore pretty irrelevant. When studying voter identification laws, there are 3 major obstacles to conducting studies on these laws that the literature highlights. Firstly, there can be a learning curve associated with the law, so it can be that perhaps in the first election cycle after the law has been implemented, that turnout does decrease, but then after that, you see that it evens out and the effect of the law is, minimized. Secondly, there can be counter-mobilization efforts. If the media is, really and truly covering these laws, and in some of the states where they're more contentious, then it's possible that then local grassroots organizations may mobilize and try to counter the effect of the law by registering more people to vote, by encouraging more people to go out to the polls. And lastly, studies have a hard time assessing the effect on potential voters or even those who are not politically active. Perhaps there's a voter that's not even registered, or technically in that case, a citizen that's not even registered, and then now they are going to be even further deterred from even registering to begin with because they might hear of this law. Furthermore, the literature has yet to examine the effect of these laws on non-traditional forms of participation. So I wanted to look at that specifically because I noticed that there was a gap in the literature. I define non-traditional forms of participation as early voting, provisional voting, and absentee voting. And my research question essentially is, do voter identification laws have an effect on non-traditional forms of participation? The main theoretical framework guiding my paper was the theory of the cost of voting, which was developed by Riker and Ortschuk. And basically this theory holds that, voting is very costly, and what we as voters receive in return does not really make voting a rational action. And basically voting is rational because we spend more time and energy going to the polls than the difference that we can make in one particular election outcome. And so using this theoretical framework, I developed my own typology of the laws. Typically, the literature makes and characterizes the laws in their own way as either minimal, non-strict, or strict based on the requirements that the particular law has. But I instead look at what is available to a voter that shows up to the polls on election day but does not have the ID required. What is available to that voter, And then based on what is available to voters in that regard, I classified my states, or all states in the study, into either minimal, non-strict, or strict. My hypothesis is that the adoption of a stricter voter identification law will lead to increased turnout rates for all forms of non-traditional voter participation, and that this will be especially the case among minority voters. I make this prediction or this hypothesis following the logic that, as the cost of voting in person increases because of the increased requirements on the increased stringency of the laws, voters will look to other methods of participation. And so they will vote absentee or vote early in order to circumvent the requirements of the law. And I expect that provisional turnout would increase as well, because there's going to be some voters that may not be aware of the requirements of the law. And so when they show up on election day and they don't have the identification, they will have to then cast a provisional ballot. For this project, my unit of analysis was counties, and the data that I chose to use came from three main sources. Firstly, I used data from the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, and from this source I gathered non-traditional turnout returns for 2008, 2012, and 2016. Then I also used data from the MIT Election Data and Science Lab for general election turnout returns for the same time period, the same years, 2008, 2012, and 2016. And lastly, I got my demographic data, which included racial data as well as population data from the American Community Survey, which is basically census data. I used the difference in differences method to conduct my analysis. The main assumption underlying the difference in differences method, or the DID method, is that in the absence of treatment, both the group that is the control group and then also what would be the treatment group would follow the same trajectory. My findings were the following. For early voting, there were no particular trends, and so therefore I was not able to draw any definitive claims about what happens when a stricter voter identification law is adopted by a state. But for absentee voting, here I have all of my findings summarized, but for absentee voting, I did find that the adoption of a stricter voter identification law produced a positive effect. What this means is that when a state adopted a stricter voter identification law, in the following elections that occurred, there was an increase in the proportion of absentee ballots cast. And so this means that there is a deterrent effect occurring when the stricter law is implemented. I also found that with provisional voting, the adoption of a stricter voter identification law produced a negative effect. And what this means is that when a state adopted a stricter voter identification law, in the following election cycle, the share of fully counted provisional ballots decreased. And this could be for a number of reasons. I found maybe that perhaps it could be because the requirements of the law are too stringent, and even if you have people going to the polls and then they don't have the identification and they choose to cast a provisional ballot, when the requirements are too strict and require too much of voters after they have cast the provisional ballot in order to get it to count, it could be that perhaps voters didn't follow through, and so therefore that's why we see the decrease. Or it can also be because election officials have discretion over provisional ballots, of course, and in some states there are no partially counted provisional ballots. Lastly, among predominantly African American counties, I only had 4 possible comparisons that I was able to make, and so therefore I did not have enough data to make any definitive conclusions as to what happens in these counties when a stricter voter identification law is adopted. For one, with absentee voting, local grassroots organizations can potentially encourage new voters to use this method instead of encouraging them to go into the polls. And it's also, possible that Republicans, who are known to be the main proponents of these laws, voter identification laws, if they discover that voters are increasingly turning to absentee voting, then it is also possible that they may try to create more barriers in that for that specific kind of voting as well. Is that if it is true that, which it is what I found, that voter identification laws have a negative effect on provisional voting, then local organizations, advocates, scholars, and Democrats can challenge the defense that Republicans might make that, well, just because we're instituting this law doesn't necessarily mean that people are no longer going to be able to vote because, they can just cast a provisional ballot. But this finding says the opposite. This finding says that, even with the backup option that people may have, they don't really follow through most of the time because of the fact that we do see the decreased share of provisional ballots.